Welcome everyone to this brand new SSTO video in which we will be taking 124 Kerbals to the moon of Laythe, which is the innermost of the 5 natural satellites of Jool. Though mostly covered in ocean, Laythe has numerous rocky sandy islands, and it's very similar to Kerbin. In fact, the in-game description reads as, when Laythe was first discovered, it was not entered in the records because the scientist in charge thought he was looking at Kerbin. So I think that kind of says it all. It really is considered the second Kerbin of this game. It has an oxygenated atmosphere, so jet engines work on it, and it's just a pretty cool place to go and visit. It's also a very long way away from Kerbin, so flying any SSTO there is considered pretty challenging by most players, I would have thought, and this mission is made even more challenging because of this beast having an enormous crew capacity and therefore enormous dry mass and therefore horrible fuel efficiency. So we've kind of skipped through most of the flight plan, but really quickly what I was essentially doing was flying at sea level pretty much until I reached about 400 meters per second, which is the speed at which the Rapiers really kick in, before steadily ascending to about between 10 and 20 kilometers up, where we're flying flat for a bit, trying to get as much speed out of the Rapier engines in air breathing mode before switching to closed cycle and ultimately getting to circularize with our nuclear engines. I've covered SSTO ascent in detail in other videos, so I didn't really feel like I needed to go too much into detail there, but there we were just pumping fuel. You can keep an eye on the Delta V readout in the top right using the Kerbal Engineer Redux readouts, and here we are performing our first burn. Now some of you may have noticed that we only have just over 4,000 meters per second of Delta V, which ordinarily is not really enough to do a Laythe mission, so we're going to be doing a few little tricks. The first one here is doing multiple burns at periapsis in order to really maximize the O-berth effect that we can gain from burning at periapsis. Just makes burns more efficient, and we're kind of gaining a little bit of Delta V extra by doing our burn at periapsis rather than either side of it. Now what we're doing at the moment may seem a little bit counterintuitive because we're actually plotting a course for Eve rather than Jool, and Eve is in the exact opposite direction to Jool. It's closer to the sun than Kerbin, whereas Jool is much further away from the sun. But there is a reason for this, and anyone that's seen my 60-seat ELU SSTO video will already be familiar with this idea of performing lots of gravity assists, because like I say, we don't have enough Delta V to just perform our burn straight to Jool, so we're going to have to basically use the gravity of both Eve and Kerbin to kind of boost our way up to Jool for a fraction of the fuel expenditure it would normally cost. Here we are just playing around with our maneuver nodes. Unfortunately, I do have to skip through a lot of these things quite quickly, and a lot of this footage is sped up just so this video isn't 50 hours long, which is what it probably would be, or at least close to that, because there was a lot of faffing around with maneuver nodes and playing around with it. I deliberately tried to not use any mods like Precise Node or Transfer Window Planner, even though both of those things are installed on my game. I'm deliberately not using them because I want to kind of showcase that this can be done in the stock game. If for whatever reason you were opposed to getting mods, or people feel it's not as impressive if it's not done in stock. Regardless, here we are just setting up our nodes. So we've not even encountered Eve yet, and we can already start planning our Kerbin assist. If you're trying to do this, I'd say your Eve assist should bring you to between Kerbin and Juna's orbit. You can get Eve assists that will boost you up to almost like Dres height, but it's not too much of an issue because you'd still need to do a Kerbin assist anyway. And in this video, we're going to be doing 2 Kerbin assists. So all in all, it's going to be 3 gravity assists to boost us up to Jool. We're just going to do a quick 12.3 meters per second of Delta V burn here, because although we were able to set up a gross Kerbin encounter earlier on, the amount of fine-tuning and precise tweaking necessary to get this kind of, here we go, there goes the assist there. To get this kind of assist, it takes a lot of fine-tuning, and you're just not able to do that without using mods with the stock maneuver nodes. So I just kind of plotted the rough encounter, and then in the knowledge that I just spend a little bit of fuel just tweaking it once we were a little bit closer to the encounter, and we could therefore, the maneuver nodes would therefore not be too limiting, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't, but that's what I'm trying to get at anyway. So here we are, just coming in for our first Kerbin gravity assist. And I know some of you might be watching this thinking, Matt, you magnificent mastermind, I learned in school that you can't make or destroy energy, so how does passing by planets suddenly just give you free amounts of speed? And that is a very good question. Gravity assists, just by their nature, can seem a little bit counterintuitive against the laws of physics because, you can't just get free energy, but we're actually stealing a small amount of orbital energy from Kerbin, or indeed any body that we're getting the gravity assist from. But due to the mind-bogglingly incomprehensible difference in vastness compared to the planet versus our tiny little spaceship, it's completely negligible, the amount of energy the planet loses. Even in the real world, NASA does not even take into account the amount of energy being quote-unquote stolen from planets, because it's just such an insignificant amount. Not that it really matters either way in this game, because the game doesn't actually model for the energy that the planets themselves lose. Obviously, it does model for the energy gained by the spacecraft, so missions like this are possible. So here we are, just playing around with our maneuver node again. We're just going to skip through a lot of the process because I don't know how entertaining watching me faffing around with a maneuver node for 10 minutes would be, but I really can't imagine it being the most enthralling thing to watch. So one thing to look at, I'm not doing it in this instance here, but for some of our more fine-tuning, precise burns, what I often do is deactivate all but one of the nuclear engines and limit its thrust to like 1%, so we can do really, really accurate, precise burns. Yeah, little top tip there if you're trying to replicate this mission. Now, when you're actually plotting gravity assists around Kerbin and Eve, it's very important to make sure that your periapsis is above the atmosphere for either planet. So the common line for Eve would be 90 kilometers above sea level, and Kerbin is 70 kilometers. Here we are with a periapsis of 71.7 kilometers above sea level, so very, very close to the edge, but just within the safe region. So we're actually going to do a very small 18 meters per second burn here, just to get our dual encounter, because we weren't quite getting it on our initial gravity assist. But there we are. We can actually do a small correction burn later on, but we are now on a dual heading. In my 60-seat ELU SSTO mission, we actually managed to get our dual encounter straight after doing our Kerbin assist, but unfortunately I wasn't quite so lucky this time around. So what I normally do when we're going to dual is that rather than circularizing in the traditional way of just burning at periapsis, fuel efficiency is of the utmost importance here, so we can actually do a gravity assist using the gravity from Laythe to actually swing us into a dual orbit, because gravity assists are great for gaining speed and sort of increasing our velocity, but they can also be used to decelerate us. And as you can see, we're getting a very eccentric but nonetheless stable orbit around Jool with basically no fuel expenditure, which is great. And just Jool in general, if you're trying to do a Jool 5 mission or just visiting Jool moons or Jool itself, then gravity assists are incredibly useful to do just to, you know, save fuel. So I think if you really want to try and learn how to do gravity assists, Jool is a fantastic place to actually get the practice, because Tylo, especially Tylo and Laythe, are brilliant for getting gravity assists. Tylo's great because it doesn't have any atmosphere, but it's basically the same mass as Kerbin, so you can hug really close to it and get really big velocity gains from it quite easily. And there we are, captured it Laythe. So we can just time warp around to Jool and, well, enter Laythe. So here we are, just passing by, and you can see me just descending here, and you'll notice our orbital speed is actually quite close by. I'll just slow it down here, and I realised that, hang on, we're not going too fast. I could probably enter the atmosphere at this speed and be okay. So I quickly quick-loaded my quick save by hitting Alt F9, which I highly recommend doing custom quick saves using Alt F5 and Alt F9 for a mission of this complexity. So we are doing one final correction to raise our periapsis to around 44 kilometers above sea level. Laythe's atmosphere ends at 50 kilometers, so we really are skimming along the edge of it, but given our 3 kilometers per second of speed, it's going to be quite hot nonetheless. So here we are, just doing my little trademark spinning technique. This just distributes the heat across the whole airframe to minimize the chances of individual parts overheating and exploding on the aircraft. And as you can see, we are now captured in a nice eccentric orbit around Laythe, so we can just open up the map view to check, but we can see the apoapsis and periapsis values on the top left using the Kerbal Engineer readouts there. So, like I say, very useful mod, but there's our map screen there. So we can just spin around again. We'll do a quick tweak of our periapsis. The most difficult thing about Laythe, you see, is picking a spot to land on, because most of it is water. It's quite hard to get our landing to be near an island. Luckily, with an aircraft like this, like one with wings and control surfaces, it's much easier to precisely land. With rocket landers, it's a little bit harder, but it's not impossible. So, yep, we're going for that landing there. So I'm kind of doing lots of sort of spinning around and angling the aircraft to try and create as much drag as possible so we don't overshoot that island. And then we can go ahead and deploy those air brakes, doing a little bit more spinning there to bleed off a bit of extra speed. But then we can deploy the gear and land, and I managed to pull it off first time. I didn't need to quick load or quick save once. It was brilliant. So here we are coming into land, and we want to make sure that our actual aircraft is sort of parallel to the ground and the actual ground itself is nice and flat and not too hilly. And we really want to be coming in nice, slow and controlled. Make sure that your prograde marker is more or less along the horizon line on the nav ball, because otherwise you'll just nosedive. And then right before we hit the ground, we can just deploy the chutes to help slow ourselves down and deploy the air brakes. Laythe is much easier to land on than Juna, because Juna's atmosphere is very thin. Parachutes and air brakes are much more valuable there. The easiest one is obviously Eve, because its atmosphere is so incredibly thick, but you won't be able to take off again. So yeah, here we are. So unfortunately with Laythe is that its gravity means that jetpacks don't work and the ladders on our ship don't actually reach the ground. So what we can do is deploy this little system I've got here where we deploy a landing leg and then retract the front gear, and the whole thing kind of goes into a kneeling position, so the ladders now reach the ground and we can just put Kerbals on EVA. Now it got so laggy that I actually had to use the mod Vessel Mover just to place the Kerbals in position, because after about 64 we're on EVA, it just became like 1 frame per second, and I have a pretty good PC. The footage you're watching has actually been sped up slightly in post-production, and it was basically unplayable, so I had to use Vessel Movers to actually pull off, but it was worth it for this shot here. So we're kind of zooming in at a pretty choppy frame rate, but there we go, just to kind of prove that, you know, they're all there. Yeah, so they're just all chilling there, just soaking up the sun rays, enjoying the the sea air, the sea breeze rolling off the waves. And there they all are, some little photos I took, and then we can get ready to embark on the ship again. I will confess I just quick loaded the point where I landed, because I was not going to go and manually board them all on again. But you could, if you wanted to do it manually, you can, using my ladder system. So there we go. So we actually gained a little bit of speed just by rolling down this hill before firing up the 2 Whiplash jets and the Rapiers before nosing up. Now obviously, when we first launched off Kerbin, this thing could only just barely get off the ground without hitting it, but now we've burned most of our fuel away. It is significantly lighter and can effortlessly get off the ground, and we don't actually need to use the closed cycle mode of the Rapiers on Laythe because it's much easier to escape from than Kerbin. So we'll just coast along on air-breathing engines, firing up the nuclear engines when we're a little bit higher up in the atmosphere, because at lower levels, sort of close to sea level, the nuclear engines are very inefficient. When I say atmospheres, I'm mainly talking about Laythe, Kerbin and Eve. Juna's atmosphere is so thin that it doesn't really affect nuclear engines in the same way. But there we are, we fired them up, and we can just keep our ascent gentle but also a little bit steep to make sure our apoapsis actually leaves the atmosphere. And there we go, 51 kilometers above sea level, so we're definitely space bound now. We'll try and raise it as much as possible because we'll be doing our circularization using the nuclear engines, and despite us having 8 of them, our thrust to weight ratio is not fantastic because of the enormous dry mass of this craft. But yeah, looking at the maneuver node there, we easily have enough time to circularize before we would end up falling back to the atmosphere again. So there we go. So now we don't have a lot of fuel left to get back to Kerbin. We'll end up with about 1,350 meters per second of delta V left. So it's not a lot. We can't do it. We certainly can't do it just by burning there in the traditional sense. We'll have to do some more gravity assist to make it. So we actually have a Val assist and a Tylo assist here. The Val assist was purely accidental. Val doesn't really have a meaningful gravity well when it comes to doing assist. It's very similar to the Mun when it comes to actual mass and all of that. So Tylo will be the mainstay of getting us back to Kerbin, and we're going to be doing 2 consecutive Tylo assists. We'll be doing 1 to boost us all the way to the edge of Joule's sphere of influence, but not quite leaving it, before swinging back round and encountering Tylo again to propel us all the way down to Kerbin level for basically no fuel. So this, That's great. So we are just fine-tuning our maneuver nodes, and we're going to try and get our apoapsis extended. You want to make sure that your actual, obviously it's a very eccentric orbit, so you want to make sure your apoapsis is pointing roughly backwards along Joule's orbit, so we'll be set up in the correct position for when we do the actual Joule escape burn. There goes Val, and then we'll just continue to swing around. We can just cut through some of that. And there is Tylo, the greatest in the world for gravity assists, because as I mentioned earlier, it has no atmosphere and it's pretty heavy, so it's brilliant for doing gravity assists. Thank you so much, squad, for making Tylo. But yeah, we can just play around with our maneuver node. Again, we can probably skip through a lot of this because it's just a long time of me faffing. But there we go, we can see us getting down to curbing that grey line there. And well, that's pretty much that, isn't it? So we'll just time warp up to the maneuver node again, skipping through most of it because it's not the most engaging thing to watch. And then we'll just perform our maneuver node there. So about 80 meters per second of delta V needed, which is far, far less than what would be required if we were doing this burn without any gravity assists. And there, look at that. We can just do some small puffs and there we go, forced us right down. Now we can do some tweaking of our actual inclination of our orbit. If we do this before we encounter Tylo, it's very, very small amounts of delta V required. So I kind of skipped through that because I did lots and lots of tiny little inclination adjustments and I couldn't really find a good way of showing all of them in a concise manner. But I hope you get the general gist of the idea. So we can add a maneuver node just after our periapsis around the sun and just drag our retrograde marker until we get a Kerbin encounter. So it's not going to take very much fuel, only about 45 meters per second of delta V, give or take. And it ultimately comes down to just playing around with our maneuver nodes and just try and get your periapsis as close to the planet as possible and make sure you get it. I mean, don't get too bogged down on whereabouts periapsis needs to be. I would just play around with the maneuver node until you get an outcome that works for you. It's the best way of doing it. Try not to get... I like to not get too bogged down into the actual physics of what I'm doing. Which I'm sure has never been said by anyone working at NASA, but this is Kerbal Space Program, not NASA, so let's not get worried about it. Let's not get bogged down in science. So we can just do our maneuver node here. So it ended up being 60 meters per second of delta V. But, you know, we've still got 555 left, so we have enough fuel to play around with, really. And there we go. Now we're going to have to do this Kerbin assist here, just because at the moment, if we encounter Kerbin as it is, we'll be going far too fast to actually enter its atmosphere without exploding. Trust me, I tried, and it was an absolute disaster because we're coming in at over 4 kilometers a second, which is really... This thing can re-enter at about 3.8 kilometers per second as the maximum speed. But you can see here our speed there was, 4,200 meters per second is a bit too fast for this ship. So we can do that gravity assist there, and we can swing around and do another one. Now, you may need to do more than one Kerbin flyby. You may even want to do an Eve encounter as well. It really depends on just what happens when you do your mission, really. I sometimes like to set the periapsis up and just create a maneuver node there just to try and get a feel for how much energy is required to get ourselves into a circular orbit, and I could tell it wasn't really going to take very much, so I reckoned that we could get our aero capture from an encounter like this. We can expend quite a big burn actually to get this encounter, but we have plenty of fuel left, so it wasn't really a concern. And there we go, we can actually see that line bringing in, and we actually switched over to our single nuclear engine and get our nice fine tuning in there. So because we're coming in very fast, we can't have our periapsis too low in the atmosphere, so 46 I think is what I went with in the end. Actually, in fact, I think it was closer to 40 by the time I actually got there. I did a quick save, and then I kind of played around with different periapsis heights until I got a capture basically. Too low and you'll explode, too high you'll just pass straight through and then leave Kerbin again. So we can do our spin again here just to help distribute the heat, because as you can see, parts are exploding. I think the first time I attempted this, the fairing blew up, so it may take you multiple tries to survive your capture, but yeah, mileage will vary from SSTO to SSTO and from player to player. But there we are, safely captured around Kerbin, so we can just swing back around to bring our apoapsis lower. I'm going to be aiming for about 100,000 meters above sea level as our ultimate apoapsis. I think in the end I had a little bit higher than that, but basically just a low Kerbin orbit is what we want. So I'm not doing that same insane spinning this time around because we're coming in at a much lower speed. So I reckoned that this ship could survive. But If it didn't survive, that's why we have F5 and F9, so we can just quick load and quick save until we get it right, which is my entire philosophy when it comes to playing this game. Now actually, we don't actually need to circularize our orbit in order to get our KSC encounter in this particular instance, so we're just going to go ahead and burn retrograde to bring our trajectory a little bit closer. I like to aim for the C between the Kerbal Space Center and that eastern peninsula, and then we can just point ourselves prograde, and depending on what our trajectory is looking like, I'll pitch up or pitch down or left or right to sort of alter how much drag I'm creating in order to encounter the Kerbal Space Center. As you can see, we're going to overshoot a little bit, so this is why I'm kind of doing all these rolls and flips to try and create as much drag as possible to slow ourselves down enough. But we do still have just over 1,000 units of liquid fuel left, and since we can now use the air-breathing engines, that will go a long way. So we have more than enough fuel to make it back to the runway. And that's pretty much this mission wrapped up. So I do hope you enjoyed it. I apologise that a lot of the finer parts of the gravity assist planning were skipped through, because really, I didn't want this video to go on too long. I generally don't like videos that go on longer than 20 minutes, and I am aware that this video has gone just over the 20-minute mark. But also, it just comes down to a lot of guesswork, really, when it comes to me planning them. I just get the encounter with the planet and tweak it until I get an outcome that I like. But there are tutorials available on YouTube. I know Scott Manley's done a gravity assist planning tutorial, so I don't really think that I need to discuss them in too much detail. If you want to try and replicate this mission, I implore that you do have a good grasp of using SSTOs and playing the game. This is definitely not a mission for novices or even amateurs at this game. You really need to have a lot of hours under your belt before attempting a mission of this scale. But I do hope you enjoyed the video. Craft file is in the description, as well as links to other space planes I've made that are slightly easier to fly than this, although they don't have the same crew capacity. And on screen now there are some videos. The one on the top left is specially selected for your viewing tastes by YouTube. Top right is my 60-seat ELU SSTO, and on the bottom right is a whole playlist of other single stage to orbits I've made. So enjoy, and again, thank you for watching.